Well, how about that? The old man has packed it up. Obviously, the word is out that former Supreme Court Justice Antonin Scalia has passed away. I offer my condolences and sympathies to all of his loved ones, to his family, his friends, those of his colleagues who were close to him and had good working relationships with him, particularly the other justice on the Supreme Court who appears to have been his best personal friend on the court, namely Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who apparently was very chummy with Justice Scalia anytime they weren't writing opinions on that minority of hot button issues that crop up before the court every year. What do I make of it? Well, as a libertarian, my views have never neatly fit into either the left-wing or right-wing category or into the Democratic or Republican column, Lord knows. The same goes for the Supreme Court. I would say that I hope Justice Scalia's successor, eventual successor, because I don't think we're going to find out for a while who is going to end up replacing him. More on that later. I hope that his successor will not be too far off politically or ideologically from where he is. I may be a libertarian, but I also happen to have pretty iconoclastic, or that is unconventional views when it comes to the interpretation of the Constitution and Supreme Court jurisprudence. I first began to leave the left, as I've put it a number of times, roughly 10 years ago in the fall of 2005 when I took a course in constitutional interpretation taught by Professor Robert George, a well-known conservative professor at Princeton. It was really at that time when I started reading a lot of these Supreme Court decisions that are so divisive in American politics that I actually started to gravitate away from the left, because it dawned on me that I actually didn't agree with a lot of the decisions the court had handed down in the past that were commonly celebrated and even treated as sacred cows by a lot of my then fellow liberals. And I thought to myself, I actually don't agree with the whole idea, for example, that the Constitution is a living, breathing document that somehow spontaneously metamorphosizes over time, that no longer has the same meaning that it had when it was first drafted and adopted. I find that a very suspicious and ultimately not very credible constitutional theory, quite frankly. It is basically a tool for judges who have a certain ideological agenda to achieve items on their ideological wish lists. That's one area in which I generally agreed, or at least sympathized with, a lot of what Justice Scalia had to say. I think he was a very powerful voice on the Supreme Court in opposition to what's often called judicial activism. Unlike a lot of my friends and former colleagues, not just liberals, but even many people in the liberty movement, I actually think there is such a thing as judicial activism. I think that it's a bad thing. I don't believe in unelected judges making the law up, and certainly not making up the Constitution as they go along, or remaking the Constitution in their own image and likeness, so to speak. I don't agree with it. I think that judges' job is to say what the law is and apply it, not to say what they think the law should be and apply the version of the law that they wish were actually enshrined in the Constitution's text. Like Justice Scalia, I wish that this whole theory of living constitutionalism would just die. With that said, one thing that I think Justice Scalia overlooked, or maybe just didn't want to admit to himself or to others, was that there is not only liberal judicial activism. There is such a thing as conservative judicial activism as well. And that's something that I learned in Professor George's ConInterp course. In fact, I think that's one of the very first things I learned in his course. He pointed out in one of the course materials that the original complaints about judicial activism in American politics didn't come from the right. They came from the left. It was President Franklin Roosevelt who first complained about right-wing judicial activism on the Supreme Court back in the 1930s, when a then still relatively conservative court was continuing in a tradition that it had begun in the late 19th century and was thwarting and striking down a lot of New Deal programs that President Roosevelt was trying to get passed. Ultimately, the Supreme Court had a change of heart in the late 1930s, began issuing a series of decisions that allowed for a vast expansion of the power of the federal government, and since then, neither the court nor the federal government, the rest of it, has looked back. One thing that President Roosevelt pointed out at the time was that the Supreme Court had arguably become a sort of super legislature, meaning basically just another branch of government, only this one unelected and thus unaccountable to the American people. I think what's basically happened to the Supreme Court in recent decades is that it's become so polarized that you basically have two wings, conservative and liberal. And, I mean, everyone knows that the court has two wings, but what I would go so far as to say is that it has two wings of judicial activists, and I would not spare Justice Scalia from that characterization. I think he was, at various times, mind you, in certain cases, a conservative judicial activist. I think he was about as much of a conservative judicial activist as his left-wing counterparts on the court are liberal judicial activists. The reason I hope that Justice Scalia's eventual replacement won't be too far off from his politics is because I think that it's unfortunate that the Supreme Court is basically split into two wings of judicial activists, left-wing and right-wing ones. But as long as that's going to be the case, it's better that the court should be more or less evenly balanced between those two factions. I don't want to see a liberal judicial activist faction become a solid majority on the court. And I don't want to see a conservative judicial activist faction become a solid, durable majority on the court either. Because once those majorities are established on the court, they can last for decades. Because these guys have lifetime appointments. As long as the Supreme Court is going to be split between liberal judicial activists and conservative judicial activists, it's best that there be 4 of each and 1 swing vote in the middle, which of course generally tends to be Justice Anthony Kennedy, who sometimes votes with the liberals and sometimes votes with the conservatives. I wish judges in general, and Supreme Court justices in particular, would do a better job of interpreting the Constitution and applying it in a way that doesn't smack of political bias. When it comes to Justice Scalia's passing, it will be interesting to see what effect it has on the presidential election campaign. I suspect the likeliest outcome is that given that the electorate is very polarized and very angry and exercised this year, President Obama will probably nominate some replacement for Justice Scalia, which is something I'm sure Scalia himself would have abhorred, the idea of a liberal Democrat in the White House choosing his successor. But of course, at the same time, Scalia would be relieved that there is at least a Republican majority in the Senate. So I think what will happen is President Obama will probably nominate a relatively moderate candidate for replacing Justice Scalia, not because he prefers a moderate. I'm sure he'd prefer a very solid liberal in the mold of his last 2 appointments, Justices Kagan and Sotomayor. But he knows that a Republican Senate will never, ever confirm such a nominee to the court, especially in this very polarized election year. I think Obama will probably nominate a relatively moderate liberal judicial nominee, Supreme Court nominee. The Republicans will go through the motions of the whole confirmation process. They'll probably vote down Obama's appointee or nominee, and then both parties will seek to use that whole exercise to their own political advantage in the election campaign. They'll try to use that to turbocharge their own respective bases and get out the vote as much as possible. Each party will tell its own constituents this is a very high-stakes election because it will determine who will replace Antonin Scalia on the Supreme Court. Democrats will tell their constituents we really need another solid liberal like Kagan or Sotomayor on the court, especially with people like Justice Ginsburg getting on in years as well. Who knows how much longer she'll be around. We really need another solid liberal on the court to overturn Citizens United, overturn the gun rights cases, overturn Shelby County versus Holder, etc., etc. And the Republicans will do much the same thing. They'll say, folks, we need to get a strong, strict constructionist, constitutional conservative on the Supreme Court to fight the scourge and pestilence of judicial activism, etc., etc., etc. See, this is why in one of my most recent videos, I didn't cry any crocodile tears over Rand Paul's decision to drop out of the presidential race. Remember, I said he's needed in the Senate. If you're someone who generally agrees with his politics, you should be glad that he's sticking around in the Senate because he's going to be needed. That's my take on Justice Scalia's passing. I don't want to see another hippie replace Antonin Scalia on the Supreme Court. There are a number of decisions in which he joined in the majority with which I agreed and with which I disagreed. And like I said earlier, as long as the court is basically going to be a sort of super legislature like FDR called it, which is basically just a higher Congress, just as politically motivated and polarized as Congress is, let it be as balanced as possible.